Commonly considered one of the top tier builds in the game, the Lightning Javazon is a perfect demonstration of veteran bias, which is a situation where a build is solely judged on its end game performance rather than its ability to progress through the game itself. That said, in those endgame situations, she does earn her reputation, especially whenever the new Sunder charms are taken into account. As far as how she performs compared to the sister build, the Infinity Amazon, she's better at killing clumped crowds like cows and flayers, but slower at killing sundered lightning immunes, act bosses, and the spread out or solo targets. This is mostly due to the focus of the builds. That said, you can combine these builds due to overlapping skill focus, but you do end up giving up your weapon swap that could be otherwise used for pre-buffs and such. Now, as you can tell by some of her common names, like Furyzon, she has a very specific skill she leans into, Lightning Fury. This skill is desired because it has a couple powerful functions that work quite well against swarms of enemies, namely launching bolts for each target nearby when it hits and having an auto-hit functionality so it always goes through to the pierce check. And it will carry these with every hit it does, that's why most will go for 100% pierce between skills and gear to maximize on this. Now, personally, I run it with a more mixed method playstyle, but it is possible to go through just dense areas and fury everything and be done with it. But I actually use its melee cousins, both the popular Charge Strike, which is your boss killer, due to all the bolts stacking up against the target, especially large ones, and not requiring you to actually hit to launch those bolts. And I also actually use Lightning Strike as well, since it works better for spread out enemies like Gloams, Leapers, and Imps, who can be a bit of a pain in the butt to zap down with skills like Fury or Charge Bolt, and Lightning Strike just automatically targets them and does all the work. As far as the other lightning skills we invest in, Lightning Bolt and Power Strike, I generally prefer maxing Lightning Bolt as a synergy first, but since you'll rarely use either of them, Power Strike can be fine as well. It's just I find Lightning Bolt to be more entertaining to use for fun, so I go with that. In terms of passive skills, this is one area I deviate from a lot of players, at least when I am converting from an already existing character to this build. Namely, I just focus on getting the point in Pierce so I can get 100% with Razor Tails, basically after plus skills of course, and with the fix to dodge, evade, and void skills, I do pick those up now as well, though in Lord of Destruction, I would generally skip them with endgame gear. Now, most players will actually get Valkyrie, and if you're doing solo self-found, you absolutely should get her, since she is a valuable tank that can make the game significantly easier, but I find her to be a waste of 4 points in endgame gear, since most enemies won't get close enough for you to need a tank, and if they do, you'll usually one-shot them with Charge Strike or Lightning Strike. Now, speaking of solo self-found, the strategy I use is a bit different since you don't have a Sunder charm, you don't have the Titans, and you don't have any of the minus resist effects like Rainbow Facets or Infinity. So you have to consider a few things. If you're going to go with a skill reset, then you'll usually just want to go a dual elemental. Personally, I like either the Frost Maiden hybrid or the Plaguezon hybrid. But let's suppose you don't want to do that skill reset. That means you need to do something else to deal with the immunes, namely Valkyrie, Jab, and Mercenaries, which will be slow going, but will get you through the game eventually. In Normal and Nightmare though, this won't be a huge issue. As long as you keep your mana potions topped off, you'll max out Charge Strike and Lightning Fury as your first two choices, and of course picking up your 1-point wonders. As far as the gear and the difficulties, just get as much resist as you can along the way, and feel free to use your cheap javelins until you can get some replenishing ones. Or even your starter javelins will actually work if you want. I have beaten the game with that. Hell was a bit of a pain in the butt. For solo self-found, you will want to get that Valkyrie as soon as you get to 30, same for Pierce, so that's where most of your points you saved or waited to use along the way will go. As far as your stats, just get enough strength and dexterity to use whatever your javelins you want in the end. Though do remember to get your stats high enough to use Titans afterwards. You don't need to worry about the upgraded version of them, but you will want enough for the normal ones. They are best in slot, and you actually can find them from a lot of places in Nightmare and beyond, of course. In Hell, difficulty is whenever you will start to struggle, and there's really no avoiding it if you want to skip a skill reset. There are areas where lightning immunes are just obscene, especially in Act 3, with some of the Flayers and Gloams being a royal nightmare, and those will have a chance of appearing all the way through the rest of Hell, with Act 4 being annoying thanks to Finger Mages as well being on that list. For these situations, you will have to rely on Jab and, of course, your Mercenary to actually take these down with a pure build like this, and that is what most guides tend to avoid talking about. The main strategy I like is, of course, upgrading my javelins to a good rare set from hell for more damage, possibly even burning an imbue on them or shopping them, and of course using some of those rubies to craft crushing blow gloves can help out too. Or if you're lucky enough to find them, one of the other sources of crushing blow like goblin toes or even duress on armor, since it's fairly affordable at Shale, and Thul. Though once you get through hell, you won't need to use those nearly as much since you'll be free to choose your preferred farming locations and can go back to faster attacks and such until you get your chase gear. Now, speaking of chase gear, there's a few options in a few of the slots, depending on what you're going to be farming. For example, in the shield slot, there's a few common options without diving into the more PvP-oriented Jeweler's Shields and Rainbow Facets. The two most common being Spirit for its plus skills, faster cast resists, and several other solid mods that is often preferred by players who run Enigma and Teleport, and then there's Phoenix, which is often preferred by more laid-back crowd farmers since it's exceptional at keeping your mana and health topped off. But it does sacrifice a small amount of damage and underperforms Spirit a bit against bosses. In the boots, you'll often either see Magic Find in the form of War Travelers or Silkweave for mana recovery per kill, which actually does quite well on this build, especially if you're farming places like cows, since you will be dropping large numbers of enemies quite quickly, refreshing your mana fairly regularly. Though if you're using Phoenix Shield, it will free up the slot for Magic Find quite easily, and if you lack a Sundered Charm, the Crushing Blow boots of your choice between Goblin Toe and Gore Rider are a solid pick here as well with Jab. In the rings, I went with Raven Frost for Cannot Be Frozen, extra durability, and it's just being a generally good ring for a lot of builds. And I went with my rare Dual Leech, mostly for the Mana Leech and Resist, since you usually won't need much Life Leech with this build. That said, if you're using Phoenix Shield, you won't need Mana Leech either, so a better Resist ring or even a Stone of Jordan would be great here for Ground Pounders, or a faster cast ring for Enigma users. Speaking of Enigma though, since I usually don't boss hunt on this build, I instead prefer Chains of Honor. It gets me solid resists and plus skills to boot, and is generally easier to do chill runs with while working on various things while I'm playing. If you want faster boss hunting though, definitely drop Enigma in here instead and use charms to cover the resistance gaps. On the belt, I go with Razor Tail for piercing, especially whenever knocking out crowded areas where you'll be using Lightning Fury a lot more. If you're going boss hunting with Enigma, go instead for Arachnid's Mesh and abuse your Charged Strike, since it will give you faster cast and plus skills for helping out with that. No, that does not increase the speed of Charged Strike, it increases your speed of Teleport. In general, T-Gods is a good kind of like option for some builds, but for this one, it is a bit of a trap. It's good, but unless you're going into lightning heavy areas, other belts will generally do better. Over on the gloves, your go-to is going to be faster attack plus skills gloves. Whether these are crafted hit power gloves, blood gloves, or even magical or rare gloves is up to you. Magical can, however, get slightly better for min-maxing your actual damage, but rare and crafted gloves can get your resist, stats, and a few other nice perks without sacrificing a noticeable amount of that damage for farming. Now, the weapon is fairly obvious. Since we're going Fury, we go Titans. Simply the best choice hands down. Some people will upgrade theirs or look for Ethereal, but for general farming, this is not going to make a massive difference outside of some select situations. On non-ethereal, even low percent versions, they'll do just fine, since most of your damage here is coming from the skills. Though if you're doing PvP, this will be different and you will want to optimize a bit better. Possibly even going for some real esoteric magic javelins. Up on top, we have the fairly obvious Griffins, which, thanks to the Sunder Charm, is actually quite useful. The Rainbow Facet is handy too. This also gives us faster cast, so you don't need to worry about swapping it out if you go Enigma. There are some niche blue diadems you can get that can be punchy too, but they're really not going to compare much to the extra work Griffin does. And in the amulet, I go with High Lords for attack speed. You don't need to be exceptionally quick on the attack speed with this build, but it's handy, and this helps us push us past the 11 frame breakpoint for throwing, where there are ways to get up to 10 frame, but I personally don't feel like the sacrifice is worth it. There are also a lot of budget options for this build, depending on how you want to play it, especially if you do have a Sundered Charm pocketed away, but pretty much the main goal will be either plus skills, mana recovery, and minus lightning resist when possible. The rest, outside of whatever survival buffs you prefer like resist in life, are going to just be extra little perks. Now, as far as Mercenary, an Act 2 Mercenary with Infinity is easily the most preferred and best choice overall, but you can also go with Act 5 Mercenaries with Plague. They will be a bit tankier, but they won't help your damage nearly as consistently or as much, so keep that in mind. But if you cannot get Sundered, then there's even more argument for an Act 5 Mercenary, since there are some relatively easy to make builds for them that can handle most lightning immunes without breaking a sweat, even the physical immune ones thanks to Lawbringer, though Infinity is still generally best assassin slot. So, do you run a Lightning Fury Amazon, or do you prefer poking around in melee with a self-wielded Infinity like we do with the build on screen now? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and even a handful that have hit that super thanks button down below that I almost completely forget about. You help keep this content alive.